World War II raged across continents, but in the vast stretches of ocean, another enemy waited, one not forged by steel or strategy. Sailors spoke in hushed tones of waves rising without wind, of shadows sliding beneath their ships longer than any submarine. Entire patrols reported strange tremors before their radios went dead, leaving only silence where fleets should have been. Those few who stumbled back from the sea described a serpent of impossible size, scales dark as midnight, eyes burning like molten fire. They didn't call it a myth, nor a legend. They named it the serpent that terrorized the war itself. Jörmungandr awakened in mankind's deadliest conflict. The oceans of World War II stretched vast and merciless, swallowing steel and men alike. Battleships and convoys moved across waters that looked calm on the surface, yet beneath them churned a world unknown. Sailors trusted charts and compasses, but they could not chart what the eye could never see. Rumors of strange disturbances spread between fleets, dismissed as nerves or fatigue. Still, the sea kept its secrets, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal them. Night patrols were the most unnerving. Darkness above meant darkness below, and sailors stared into black horizons with unease. Many swore they felt the water rise and fall in ways no tide could explain. Ripples struck hulls with the weight of waves, though skies were clear and winds calm. The more they searched for rationality, the more the sea resisted explanation. To them, silence at sea was never safety. It was a prelude. Reports filtered through naval command of vessels disappearing without enemy fire. Entire patrol boats failed to check in, leaving nothing but static on radios. The ocean carried no wreckage, no survivors, only the echo of last transmissions. Men whispered theories in cramped quarters, inventing answers their commanders refused to give. Yet each answer pointed towards something massive, something unseen, moving through the depths like a shadow too large to comprehend. In the freezing Atlantic, sailors reported hearing low rumbles vibrating through the hull. They likened it to a giant engine, yet no sonar detected submarines nearby. One veteran swore it rattled his teeth, as though the sound itself was alive. These vibrations carried a strange rhythm, pulsing in intervals that did not belong to machines. Some prayed it was nothing more than seismic activity, though their prayers carried little conviction. The Pacific told its own stories. Islands scattered across the ocean acted as outposts, but many became sites of strange disappearances. Fishing vessels docked at remote ports left empty, their lines tangled and hulls scraped raw. Local guides muttered warnings in hushed voices, speaking of serpents that had lived in the waters long before war. Soldiers laughed at these tales during daylight, but when night fell, they checked the waterline more often than they admitted. Convoys dreaded fog more than storms. In thick mist, shapes appeared where none should be. Sailors reported vast shadows gliding alongside their ships, too large for submarines, too fast for whales. Some claimed they saw coils breach the water for only seconds before vanishing again. They fired flares into the haze, but light revealed nothing concrete, only disturbed waves rocking their vessels violently. Fear lingered even after the mist cleared. Survivors of sunken ships told chilling stories in infirmaries. They spoke of waters that pulled harder than drowning currents, dragging men downward with irresistible force. Some claimed to have glimpsed scales beneath the foam, glistening like iron in moonlight. Others swore that eyes, massive, glowing, unblinking, peered up at them just before unconsciousness took hold. Many dismissed these accounts as hallucinations born of trauma, yet patterns repeated too often to ignore. The pressure of the deep became a weapon against sanity. Submarine crews, already confined in steel coffins, reported sonar echoes that defied classification. Signals bounced back with curves and distortions no enemy vessel could produce. These readings grew erratic near certain stretches of ocean, then cut off entirely as if consumed by something larger. Engineers scratched their heads, officers ordered silence, but sailors whispered that they were being followed. One battleship recorded a phenomenon never explained. During a routine patrol, its deck trembled violently as though struck from below. No explosion followed, no torpedo trails were seen. Instead, a wave taller than any swell struck its hull, flooding compartments and throwing men overboard. Panic erupted, but when searchlights scanned the sea, nothing surfaced, Only foaming water churned violently, as if hiding the retreat of something immense. Legends began spreading from navy to navy, traveling faster than official orders. Sailors told each other to beware the deep stretches where compasses spun wildly. They shared stories of ships swallowed whole, of men who vanished without screams. These tales grew darker with every retelling until even hardened captains could not silence them. Some officers claimed such fear kept discipline sharp. Others wondered if fear was the only thing keeping men alive. The Atlantic crossings were long and grueling, and fatigue sharpened imagination. Yet even skeptics found themselves staring too long at the sea. Shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally, reflections bent at wrong angles. A sailor once described the water as watching back, though he could never explain why. Men laughed nervously, but laughter thinned quickly, especially when night watches brought nothing but the endless black of the horizon. Secrecy surrounded incidents that could not be explained. Reports of missing vessels often ended in vague phrases, lost to weather, enemy action, or no survivors. Those who questioned too deeply faced reprimand, but rumors traveled where official documents could not. Soldiers swapped fragments of information, piecing together patterns that command ignored. In every story, one detail remained: the ocean seemed to hunger. Not every encounter ended in disaster. Some ships survived brushes with the unexplainable, though their crews bore scars of fear. Sailors spoke of vast wakes that appeared suddenly, stretching for miles, with nothing visible above the water. Others described hearing roars, low, guttural, bone-shaking, though no creature surfaced. When officers demanded silence, the men obeyed outwardly. Inwardly, they swore never to forget. On calm nights, when the sea should have been placid, disturbances grew most violent. Waves broke without wind, spray leapt from flat waters, and decks groaned under sudden strain. Lanterns flickered as though unseen hands passed too close. Some men claimed they felt eyes on them, though no stars shone above to cast light. Sleep became impossible, as sailors lay awake, listening for sounds no ocean should make. The deeper oceans swallowed evidence. Unlike land battles, where ruins and scars could be catalogued, the sea left nothing behind. A ship gone beneath waves took with it every clue, every body, every weapon. This silence allowed legends to thrive, for absence was fertile ground for imagination. Yet imagination alone could not explain the growing number of vanished vessels. Storms added further confusion. When a ship failed to return, commanders often blamed weather, citing waves and lightning. But sailors who survived storms swore these tempests were unnatural. Lightning lit coils twisting in the water, thunder seemed to roar from below, and waves bent not with wind, but with unseen movement. To them, storms were not accidents, they were cover for something older. Local fishermen, especially in northern waters, refused to sail during certain seasons. They claimed the sea grew restless, rising higher and deeper than before. Stories of ancient serpents had been told for centuries, but during the war, these legends found new life. Soldiers dismissed them at first, but too many fishermen vanished without a trace. Eventually, even hardened outsiders learned to respect the warnings. Naval charts quietly marked zones where disappearances occurred most often. Officially, these were labeled hazard areas due to currents or storms. Unofficially, sailors nicknamed them with dread the Serpent's hunting grounds, the endless throat, the void. Ships passing through kept silent on deck as though speaking aloud might invite attention. Silence became ritual, a way to avoid being noticed by what lurked below. Tales spread of survivors pulled from lifeboats days after attacks. These men rarely spoke, and when they did, their accounts defied reason. Some whispered of walls of scales brushing against their vessels. Others swore a massive eye rose above the water, watching them before retreating. Many refused to sail again, their fear outweighing duty. Command dismissed them as broken men, yet their words lingered. Among soldiers, superstition thrived. Men carried charms, whispered prayers before watch, and avoided saying certain words aloud. To them, luck was as much armor as steel. Some believed that acknowledging the serpent made it stronger. Others believed it already knew their names. Either way, silence became protection. and rituals spread like wildfire through fleets. The enemy was not always human. Torpedoes, mines, and submarines were expected dangers. But the notion of an ancient beast hunting in modern war rattled even the strongest. To soldiers raised on myths and legends, the sea's endless darkness seemed a fitting lair for monsters. The serpent became both symbol and fear, blending folklore with the brutality of war. Whispers reached commanders, though they buried them under official silence. They could not allow panic to infect fleets already strained by war. Yet silence gave the legends more power, for men trusted each other's whispers more than official reports. Every unexplained loss became evidence. Every survivor's account another piece of the puzzle. The serpent grew larger in their minds with each retelling. Nightmares haunted sailors as much as reality. Many dreamed of coils wrapping around their vessels, crushing them slowly until the sea rushed in. Others dreamed of eyes, glowing from beneath the surface, watching without blinking. These dreams spread across crews, often described in uncanny detail by men who had never spoken to each other. Fear seeped from sleep into waking life, blurring the line between dream and truth. The sea remained undefeated. Wars raged above, but beneath lay mysteries too vast to confront. Sailors accepted this silently, acknowledging what they could not fight. To them, the serpent was not enemy nor ally, but inevitability, a reminder that man's machines were small against the weight of legend. And as the war carried on, they feared that each voyage might be the one where the sea decided to claim them. History remembers the battles fought on land and air, yet the oceans carried their own stories, ones unrecorded in books, whispered only in mess halls and night watches. To the men who sailed, the war was not only against nations but against the shadows beneath their hulls. And though records remained silent, the sailors knew the truth. Something vast and ancient moved beneath, a horror no victory could erase. The oceans grew still after nights of battle, the surface calm and unbroken, as though nothing had happened. Yet below, silence lingered heavy, unnerving to sailors who knew the sea was never truly still. They spoke of an absence, a quiet that pressed against the hulls until it became unbearable. To them, it felt less like peace and more like the breath being held by something massive. The depths seemed alive with patience. In sonar rooms, operators leaned over their instruments, straining for faint echoes. At first, the screens pulsed only with emptiness, the void of deep water. Then came distortions, faint signals that curved unnaturally and returned slower than they should. Technicians reported them, but commanders dismissed the results as equipment malfunction. Still, the men who worked those machines knew when something was wrong. They could feel the presence long before seeing it. The silence was never uniform. It came in waves, pockets of absolute stillness where no sound traveled. Sailors described these patches as suffocating, as though the water itself swallowed every noise. No fish leapt, no gulls circled, no waves splashed against hulls. Engines hummed on deck, yet their vibrations seemed muted, dampened by something unseen. Men whispered that these were places the sea had claimed as its own domain. Night amplified the unease. Without stars above or waves below, sailors stood on decks, surrounded by a vast emptiness. They clutched their rifles and stared into the void, imagining shapes just out of reach. Lanterns barely pierced the black water, their reflections lost instantly in the abyss. Some claimed they saw ripples spreading across flat seas, as though something enormous stirred far beneath. Others swore they heard faint groans rising through the steel. Storms passed quickly, leaving seas oddly smooth in their wake. But sailors noticed the calm afterward was too sharp, too deliberate. It was as if the ocean had been waiting for quiet, biding its time until it could rise again. Men trained to watch the skies for enemy bombers began to watch the sea instead, scanning for disturbances no manual prepared them for. They found none, which only made the waiting worse. Stories spread quickly in tight quarters. Crews spoke of ships vanishing after sailing through stretches of unbroken water. Survivors, when they existed, described eerie stillness before disaster struck. They insisted the silence came first, followed by sudden tremors that shook vessels from beneath. These accounts grew difficult to dismiss when similar stories surfaced from different fleets. Across oceans thousands of miles apart, the pattern was unmistakable, though no one dared admit it aloud. When silence pressed hardest, even the bravest men faltered. Radios sputtered static, compasses wavered, and clocks ticked slower as though time itself had grown heavy. The sea offered no clues, no warning signs, only anticipation. A young sailor once likened it to standing inside a cathedral, moments before collapse, the air too thick to breathe. Those who endured such nights carried the memory with them forever. The deep was not empty. Fishermen had long claimed certain waters held creatures larger than ships, their movements too slow for human eyes. During the war, these stories grew teeth. Sailors described shadows gliding beneath their vessels, shapes so vast they could not be measured. They never surfaced, never broke the water, but their presence warped the silence. Men felt watched, not by an enemy fleet, but by something older than nations. One destroyer reported unusual activity during a routine patrol. Its instruments failed in unison. Lights flickering, engines sputtering without cause. The crew gathered on deck, staring into waters that reflected nothing. A sudden tremor shook the hull, so subtle it might have been ignored under other conditions. But the silence magnified every vibration until it felt like the heartbeat of something stirring below. Panic spread quickly, though no attack came. Submarine crews fared worst in these moments. Trapped beneath the waves, they lived closest to the silence, feeling it press against their walls like a living weight. Sonar returned strange echoes, sometimes too many, sometimes none at all. Men swore they heard faint drumming on the outside of their vessels, as though something massive brushed past. They sat motionless, afraid to move, knowing noise could invite attention from whatever shared the depths. Sailors developed rituals to cope. Some knocked on hulls before night watch, asking for safe passage. Others carried talismans, convinced they could keep the sea's attention at bay. These superstitions were rarely mocked, for even skeptics grew pale when the silence descended. It was not fear of the unknown, it was the certainty that something was waiting. The ocean had always been vast, but in those moments, it felt claustrophobic. Legends from coastal villages resurfaced among the ranks. Elders spoke of serpents that circled the world, slumbering in trenches deeper than light. They warned of the times when silence swallowed the seas, marking the stirring of such creatures. Soldiers, hardened by war, laughed at these tales during the day. But when night fell and silence returned, laughter vanished. Eyes widened, and every creak of the hull became unbearable. Convoys traveling through quiet zones noted strange weather patterns. Fog appeared without warning, thicker than natural, rolling across decks in suffocating waves. Within the haze, sounds vanished completely. Commands shouted from one end of the ship failed to reach the other. Men clung to rails, disoriented by the lack of reference. When the fog cleared, some vessels reported missing crew, men who had been there one moment and gone the next. Ships tasked with search and rescue often returned empty-handed. Survivors rarely spoke more than fragments, muttering about the sea opening beneath them. They described walls of black water rising without warning, pulling them under with impossible force. Some swore they saw eyes glowing beneath the foam, watching coldly as men drowned. Command chalked these tales up to delirium. Yet the silence between accounts spoke volumes. Sailors began to dread stretches of water more than enemy fire. Battle was chaos, noisy, and violent, but at least it was familiar. Silence, however, was alien. It stripped men of their confidence, leaving them exposed in ways bullets never could. When engines faltered or radios fell quiet, hearts raced with terror. For them, the ocean's calm was no gift. It was a predator's pause. One fleet crossing the mid-Atlantic reported consecutive nights of unnatural quiet. On the third night, sonar picked up faint vibrations unlike any ship. Before crews could react, the waters rose violently, tossing vessels like toys. No enemy aircraft were sighted, no submarines detected. The disturbance ended as quickly as it began, leaving behind fractured hulls and broken men. Silence returned afterward, heavier than before. Some captains tried to rationalize the phenomenon. They blamed currents, seismic shifts, even whales migrating in unusual patterns. Their words carried little conviction, for their own eyes betrayed them. They had seen shadows too large, wakes too violent, and silence too deliberate. They knew nature could not explain everything, and though they held authority, fear eroded their certainty, one encounter at a time. Night after night, the silence returned, wearing down nerves. Men grew restless, snapping at each other over small mistakes. The lack of sound became unbearable, driving some into fits of rage or despair. Others sank into quiet resignation, staring at the water with hollow eyes. Discipline wavered and morale sank, for the silence stripped away courage faster than bullets ever could. In the mess halls, conversations grew darker. Men speculated about the size of what moved below, trading numbers as though they could contain the truth with measurements. Some believed the creatures spanned miles, circling the oceans unseen. Others imagined coils thick as battleships, wrapped around the world itself. Each theory grew wilder than the last, yet none dismissed the idea entirely. The silence gave weight to every word. One account described a lifeboat adrift for days. Survivors huddled together, their voices hushed, though no enemy was near. They claimed the sea itself hushed them, punishing any sound above a whisper. When one man cried out in madness, the waters beneath surged violently, nearly capsizing the boat. He fell silent quickly, and none dared speak louder again. For them, survival meant surrendering to the quiet. Coastal watchers confirmed unusual events near shorelines. Waves broke without wind, pulling sand outward in long, violent strokes. Nets cast into these waters returned empty, as though the sea itself had been stripped of life. Locals avoided these places entirely, calling them cursed. Soldiers laughed at first, but when their own supplies dwindled after fishing attempts, laughter died. Hunger became a small price compared to what the silence promised. The silence was not random. It moved with intent, appearing across oceans at times that mirrored naval deployments. Men began to wonder if it followed them, hunting fleets as predators stalk herds. This thought spread quickly, turning unease into paranoia. They could fight submarines, track planes, and repel enemies. But how could they fight silence itself? It seeped into every crevice, unstoppable, unchallenged. In rare moments, the silence broke violently. Roars echoed through waters, shaking hulls and rattling bones. These sounds carried no origin, no explanation, yet they lingered in men's minds long after they faded. Some claimed it was the sea reclaiming its voice. Others swore it was a warning. Either way, those who heard it never sailed the same again. Decades later, documents revealed strange omissions in naval records. Patrols listed as unaccounted or lost bore no detail, no enemy activity. Their silence mirrored the sea itself, erasing truth with ink. Historians puzzled over these gaps, but sailors knew the answer. The war may have raged on land and air, but beneath the waters something else stirred, and in its silence, it revealed a hunger as endless as the ocean. The depths never truly slept. They waited in silence, patient and eternal, reminding all who dared sail across them that victory above the waves meant nothing to what lurked below. The men who survived carried that knowledge quietly, never fully speaking it aloud. For silence was not absence, it was presence, and once it awakened, the sea was never truly still again. The clash came suddenly. Without warning from radar or watchman, sailors had grown accustomed to silence, but this was different. This was impact. The deck shuddered under their boots, as though the vessel itself had struck land in the middle of open water. Metal screamed as rivets strained against forces no blueprint had ever considered. Men scrambled to their posts, but confusion spread faster than orders. Something enormous was striking them from below. Searchlights tore through the dark, slicing across empty waters. The sea appeared calm, deceptively smooth, until waves began to rise in unnatural arcs. The ship lurched sideways, steel grinding against a mass hidden just beneath the surface. Sailors clung to rails, staring in disbelief as their mighty vessel seemed powerless against an unseen force. Panic brewed in their eyes, for they were trained to fight enemies of flesh and steel, not myth. Gun crews sprang to action, loading shells and aiming at shadows that refused to surface. Every ripple was a target, every disturbance treated as a threat. The cannons roared, explosions thundering across the waves. Yet when the smoke cleared, no wreckage floated. No submarine surfaced. Instead, the water frothed violently, boiling as though something massive stirred beneath. The men realized their weapons had struck only emptiness. Then came the sound, a deep rolling bellow that vibrated through steel and bone alike. It was not the crack of artillery, nor the churn of engines. It was alive, resonant, older than language, and filled with fury. Men covered their ears, yet the roar rattled inside their skulls, pressing against thoughts until panic shattered discipline. Officers shouted commands, but their voices were swallowed whole by the monstrous cry. The surface erupted, a coil thicker than any mast whipped upward, water cascading from its scaled surface. It smashed against the hull with the force of a battering ram, denting steel like tin. The ship groaned, its structure bending under pressure it was never built to withstand. Sparks showered the deck as machinery failed, lights flickering in desperate resistance. The Serpent had finally revealed itself, and steel was no match for its wrath. Depth charges were armed in haste, dropped overboard like desperate prayers. Explosions thundered below, shaking the ocean and sending plumes of spray skyward. For a moment, hope flickered. The crew thought they had struck true, but then the sea answered, hurling the ship upward with terrifying force. The Serpent had merely shifted, coils rolling through the depths with power no bomb could tame. The men realized they were not hunting. It was hunting them. Another impact struck the bow, bending plates inward. Water rushed through seams, flooding compartments in seconds. Damaged crews scrambled with pumps and welding torches, but the breach spread faster than they could contain. Sailors waded through rising water, their tools useless against the relentless flood. They whispered prayers under their breath, knowing the Serpent could crush the entire vessel with a single movement if it chose. Torpedo tubes fired blindly, streaking into the darkness. Trails of foam vanished into the void, followed by muffled detonations far below. For a heartbeat, silence returned. Men clutched each other, daring to hope. Then the ship tilted violently, nearly capsizing as something slammed its keel. The Serpent had circled beneath, striking with the precision of a predator toying with its prey. The hope collapsed into raw terror. Spotlights caught glimpses at last, scales glistening like wet iron, jagged ridges cresting the waves, and an eye that burned with unnatural light. Its size defied comprehension. Each coil alone seemed as long as the ship. The men froze, weapons slack in their hands, for they knew no steel on earth could match such enormity. The sight was not merely terrifying, it was humbling. Humanity's greatest war machines looked like toys in its presence. The beast struck again, tearing lifeboats from their davits with a sweep of its tail. Wood splintered, ropes snapped, and fragments rained across the deck. Sailors ducked for cover, but nowhere felt safe. Every impact sent tremors through the vessel, rattling teeth and bones alike. The crew realized they were not in a battle. They were in a storm of flesh and scales, and their steel vessel was little more than driftwood. The ship's sirens wailed, blaring abandoned ship orders that no one wanted to hear. Men hesitated, staring at the black water, knowing escape might mean plunging into the Serpent's domain. Yet staying aboard a sinking steel coffin offered no safety either. Some leapt anyway, vanishing instantly beneath waves that churned as if swallowing them whole. Their screams echoed only briefly before silence reclaimed them. Above, the guns roared again, more from desperation than strategy. Shells burst across the water, throwing up geysers that illuminated the Serpent's coils for fleeting moments. Each glimpse burned into memory. The sheer scale, the impossible reach, the speed with which it moved through waves. The creature did not retreat, did not falter. It advanced relentlessly, undeterred by fire or steel. Fear spread like wildfire, more destructive than any shell. One officer shouted to ram the beast, urging the helmsman to turn the bow into the threat. The ship responded sluggishly, engines straining against the weight of the sea. For a brief moment it seemed the steel leviathan of man would meet the Serpent head-on, but the beast anticipated, sliding aside with grace no vessel could match. It struck the stern with devastating force, tearing through plating as though it were paper. Flames erupted as fuel lines ruptured, fire racing across the deck. Smoke choked the men, blinding them as they fought to keep the guns loaded. Heat and water mingled, creating a chaos no training manual had prepared them for. Yet amid the inferno, the Serpent's shadow loomed larger still, its presence undeniable even through walls of flame. The sea itself seemed to bow in reverence to its power. Some sailors swore they saw the creature's head break the surface, jaws lined with teeth like shattered spears. It opened its maw, and the roar that followed drowned every other sound. The very air vibrated, shaking lungs and hearts until men collapsed in agony. The scream was not merely noise, it was domination, a reminder that this was its domain, and they were intruders who dared challenge it. The ship listed dangerously, its deck tilting as water poured through torn bulkheads. Men slid across slippery steel, grasping at ropes and rails to avoid tumbling into the black water. Some disappeared overboard anyway, their cries lost in the cacophony. Those who remained clung desperately to their duties, though their eyes betrayed despair. Courage had not left them, but the realization of hopelessness had set in. Depth charges detonated again, this time closer. The blasts rocked the sea, momentarily scattering waves. For a heartbeat, the Serpent withdrew, its coils sinking into the black. Relief swept through the crew, fragile and fleeting. Then came a surge of water, a wall taller than masts, crashing down upon the deck. The beast had not retreated. It had risen, and the ship was powerless to resist its wrath. Radio operators screamed into their transmitters, sending frantic calls for aid. Their messages were garbled by static, interference pulsing in unnatural rhythms. Some swore the static carried voices, guttural tones echoing the Serpent's roars. Whether truth or terror-born illusion, the effect was the same: despair. No help would arrive in time. The sea had claimed its battlefield, and the men aboard knew they were already defeated. The Serpent's coils constricted around the hull, bending steel with groans louder than thunder. Rivets popped like gunshots, pipes ruptured, and compartments collapsed inward. Men were crushed where they stood, screams cut short by the grind of metal against scales. The ship, a marvel of engineering, was reduced to prey within the beast's grip. Its destruction was not swift but deliberate, as though the Serpent savored every moment. Fire consumed what water had not. Ammunition stores erupted in violent blasts, tearing sections of the vessel apart. Shrapnel rained across the deck, cutting down survivors who had nowhere to run. The Serpent moved with indifference, weaving through fire and chaos as though unbothered. To it, the explosions were no more than sparks against its ancient hide. The war of men meant nothing to such a force. Some sailors caught fleeting glimpses beneath the waves, rows of scales stretching into darkness, coils vast enough to circle the world. They realized the creature's true size was beyond comprehension. What they saw was not the whole, but merely a fraction rising to the surface. The rest lay hidden in depths man could never reach. The thought alone broke spirits. For how could one fight a foe larger than oceans? Abandoning ship became the only option. Lifeboats were launched in haste, though most were smashed before they touched water. Men clung to debris, paddling through flames and waves, praying the Serpent would ignore them. Some prayed to gods, others to the sea itself, bargaining for mercy. Yet the waters boiled anew, and many were dragged under, their prayers silenced in seconds. Survival became a matter of luck, not strength. As dawn crept across the horizon, what remained of the vessel slipped beneath the waves. Smoke hung heavy in the air, mingling with the cries of scattered survivors. The sea calmed as though nothing had happened, ripples fading into deceptive serenity. Yet those who floated in the wreckage knew the truth. The Serpent had not retreated in defeat, it had simply returned to the depths, waiting for the next collision of steel and scale. The war above continued, with planes and tanks clashing across continents. But for the men who survived that night, nothing compared to the terror of the ocean's wrath. They carried scars invisible to most, memories etched into their bones. When they spoke of the battle, their words were dismissed as madness, exaggeration, or myth. Yet in their eyes burned the truth. Steel could not conquer what had ruled the depths since the dawn of time. History recorded the loss as another casualty of war, another ship gone to enemy fire. But no records mention the scales, The roar, the coils that crushed steel into ruin. The silence of official reports ensured the Serpent's existence remained legend. Yet legends are born from truth, and the survivors knew what had happened. They had seen steel and myth collide, and the outcome was forever carved into their souls. The seas had always carried whispers of beasts too vast to be real, but sailors in the war dismissed them as old stories told to pass lonely nights. That dismissal ended the first time something vast and scaled shattered the calm. The ocean bulged unnaturally, lifting steel hulls as though they weighed nothing. What surfaced was not storm or submarine, but a living myth, tearing free from the black depths as if history itself had cracked open. Men froze in disbelief as scales glistened in the dim light, ridges of ancient armor rising higher than masts. Water cascaded down its body like rivers, each drop striking the decks like bullets. The sheer size defied measurement. It seemed to stretch into the horizon. Eyes wide with terror, sailors realized that the stories they mocked in taverns and barracks had not been fiction. They had been warnings. Searchlights swept across the waves, catching fragments of the beast's form. One moment they illuminated a vast coil, the next a jaw lined with teeth glinting like spears. The enormity of it was impossible to comprehend at once. Men tried to put words to what they saw but failed. Language faltered in the face of the unearthly. What rose before them was not just a creature, but a legend stepping into the world of men. The reaction on deck was chaos. Some shouted for weapons, their voices breaking from panic. Others dropped to their knees, clutching rosaries or muttering prayers, convinced they were staring at something divine or demonic. Discipline dissolved in the face of awe. Orders were drowned out by screams, and still the monster rose higher, its form breaking the surface like a mountain pushed from below. The air filled with the stench of salt and decay, an odor that burned lungs and coated tongues. Men gagged, covering their mouths, yet their eyes refused to look away. The smell seemed to radiate from the beast itself, a scent of centuries sealed in trenches where no light had ever reached. This was not a creature that belonged to any ocean men knew. It was older, deeper, summoned by a war that shook the earth. One officer raised binoculars, his hands trembling too violently to hold them steady. Through the lenses, he saw the unblinking eye of the serpent staring directly back. It was vast, reflective, alive with a glow that seemed both intelligent and merciless. He dropped the binoculars instantly, stumbling back as if struck. The men around him didn't need explanation. They felt the gaze too, even without glass to magnify it. Weapons fired, but the sea swallowed the noise. Machine guns rattled uselessly, tracers streaking across the serpent's body like sparks against stone. Shells exploded along its length, scattering spray but leaving no wounds. Each strike only highlighted its immensity, each flash revealing more of its endless coils. Panic hardened into despair as men realized their war machines could not scar a creature that had slept through centuries. The serpent retaliated not with claws or teeth, but with movement. It surged forward, sending a wall of water crashing across the decks. Men were swept from their posts, tossed into the sea like dolls. Screams echoed briefly before being drowned. The ship shuddered violently, and sailors clung to rails slick with seawater, knowing a second surge could sweep them away forever. Those who dared look overboard caught fleeting glimpses of its true enormity. Beneath the foaming surface, coils thicker than the ship itself twisted lazily, gliding with terrifying ease. Some swore they saw more than one coil, suggesting the portion above water was only a fragment of its total size. The realization sank into their bones. They were facing not just a beast, but a world unto itself. The ocean roared louder than guns as the creature exhaled. A gust of air, hot and foul, blasted across the decks, throwing men off their feet. Lanterns shattered, flames sputtered, and shadows stretched wildly. Some sailors clutched their ears, swearing the sound carried words, guttural tones beyond comprehension. Whether truth or madness, the impression was clear. The serpent's presence was not mindless, it was purposeful. Fear turned to paralysis for many. Men who had braved torpedoes, bombs, and firestorms now stood frozen, their courage stripped by the weight of myth. Their weapons hung useless at their sides. Their eyes, wide with disbelief, reflected the glimmer of scales as the monster circled them. The war above had rules. This did not. The beast existed outside their understanding, and that truth shattered resolve. Amid the chaos, one sailor whispered the name passed down through Nordic tales, Jörmungandr. His voice cracked as he said it, and the others recoiled. The word hung heavy in the air, forbidden yet undeniable. They realized with horror that they had not awakened a beast of the sea. They had disturbed something woven into legend itself, and now it had answered the call of war. The serpent struck again, not to destroy outright, but to remind them of their helplessness. It rose high, then crashed down with a force that split waves like earthquakes. The ship buckled, metal shrieking as beams bent and rivets popped. Water surged across decks, extinguishing fires but drowning men trapped below. The sea itself had become the serpent's weapon, wielded with effortless mastery. A desperate torpedo barrage streaked into the depths, detonating in bursts of fire and foam. For a moment it seemed the serpent faltered, its coils recoiling as shockwaves rippled through the sea. Hope sparked across terrified faces. Then the beast rose higher than ever, its roar shaking the heavens, louder than any storm or bomb. That sound alone crushed hope, leaving nothing but the certainty of doom. Men leapt into lifeboats, some without orders, driven purely by survival instinct. Wooden hulls slapped the water and shattered instantly beneath thrashing coils. Survivors clung to splinters, paddling through blood and oil, praying the serpent would spare them. But the waves themselves seemed alive, pulling them deeper into the chaos. Escape was an illusion. The sea belonged to the beast now, and it tolerated no trespass. The eye appeared again, this time closer, so near that men swore they felt its gaze pressing into their very souls. It did not blink. It did not waver. It studied them with the cold certainty of a predator evaluating prey. Some screamed at the sight, others collapsed into silent sobs, but all understood the same truth. They were insects before a storm. The serpent had risen, and they could do nothing. Those who tried to fight on fired weapons until barrels burned. The serpent's scales reflected the sparks like mirrors, turning their fury into mockery. Each bullet, each shell seemed to prove their weakness. The beast's movements grew almost leisurely, as though it recognized their efforts as futile. It circled them like a cat around a trapped mouse, prolonging terror as much as destruction. One explosion rocked the horizon, a ship further away breaking apart under unseen force. Flames licked the sky as men watched another vessel vanish into chaos. The serpent did not need to fight them all. It simply reminded them that none of them were beyond reach. Warships designed to dominate oceans now sank without dignity, dragged down by coils no engineer could defend against. The cries of the dying carried faintly through the mist, blending with the serpent's roars. Some survivors claimed the sounds merged, human screams and monstrous bellows twisting into one horrific chorus. They swore the sea itself had begun to sing. A dirge of destruction, whether true or imagined. It marked the moment the line between legend and reality fully broke. There was no separating myth from war anymore. Flames reflected off the serpent's scales, turning it into a nightmare of fire and shadow. Every roll of its body crushed waves, sending spray into the sky like rain. Ships around it fired desperately, their shells carving the sea but never the beast. Each explosion illuminated its vast frame, showing men just enough to feed their terror, but never enough to measure its full size. Commanders barked orders over radios, their words frantic, clipped with fear. They tried to rally the fleets, to form lines, to organize an impossible fight, but the serpent paid no mind to formations. It chose its targets with indifference, striking where it pleased, its presence scattering fleets as though they were nothing but schools of fish. For the first time, navies realized control of the sea was an illusion. One sailor later wrote that he had never felt smaller in his life. Surrounded by war machines backed by the might of nations, he still felt like a child staring into a nightmare too big to comprehend. His journal described the serpent not as an enemy, but as inevitability, a force of nature that man's arrogance had disturbed. He survived, but his words carried the weight of someone who knew survival meant nothing in the face of eternity. When dawn broke, the Serpent slipped beneath the waves once more. The seas calmed as though nothing had happened, smoke dissipating into the horizon. Wrecks floated quietly. Men clung to debris, and silence returned to the waters. But the survivors knew it was not gone. It had risen once, and legends no longer belonged to stories. They had witnessed truth break the surface, and it would haunt them forever. History would file the destruction under routine losses of war. Reports cited enemy submarines, mines, or storms, but sailors knew better. They had looked into the eyes of a legend and seen it move with their own. For them, the war was no longer just against nations. It was against something far older and infinitely stronger, waiting patiently beneath the sea. Wreckage sank quickly after the Serpent's fury, vanishing into the abyss as though claimed by the sea itself. Yet, long after ships disappeared from the surface, something remained. Survivors spoke of strange sounds carried across waves, low groans, metallic screeches, and whispers that seemed to echo from nowhere. These were not the natural noises of a sea settling after battle. They felt deliberate, purposeful, as though the drowned ship still cried out from below. At night, the echoes grew louder. Men aboard nearby convoys reported hearing distress signals long after radios had gone silent. Static gave way to fragmented voices, repeating calls for help from vessels already confirmed destroyed. Some dismissed this as interference, yet the details were uncanny. Call signs of ships lost days earlier echoed perfectly, their final words carried across the airwaves as if replayed by the ocean itself. Sonar operators detected phantom returns in areas where ships had sunk, their screens lit with signals that appeared, vanished, and returned again, often in the shape of vessels that no longer existed. Officers logged these as malfunctions, but the operators disagreed. They swore the pings matched the outlines of the drowned, moving slowly as though drifting through the depths, refusing to rest. Machines captured what men already felt. Something lingered. Sailors began to hear noises through the hull at night. Rhythmic knocks echoed faintly, as though hands pounded from the other side of steel. Some claimed they heard voices calling names, familiar tones belonging to comrades lost in recent battles. Men froze, staring at each other, afraid to answer. Was it memory, imagination, or something worse? Few dared speak of it openly, but many shared the same haunted expression. Debris fields drifted across currents, yet survivors swore some pieces behaved strangely. Lifeboats with no crew moved in circles, as if tethered by unseen hands. Planks creaked without wind, ropes tightened and slackened on their own. Fishermen who stumbled upon these remnants avoided them, muttering prayers as they turned their boats away. They claimed the wreckage carried more than timber and steel. It carried memory, restless and unwilling to sink fully. The sea itself began to sound unnatural. Waves carried groans that echoed like the tortured creak of hulls under strain. Gusts of wind whistled in patterns too measured to be random, almost like voices repeating orders. Men lying awake swore they heard marching, faint and distant, coming from beneath the waves. When they pressed ears to the deck, the sounds grew clearer, boots on metal echoing through the bones of drowned ships. Some survivors described dreams too vivid to ignore. They dreamed of walking the flooded decks of their lost vessels, water lapping at their ankles, yet still hearing engines hum as though alive. In these dreams, their comrades stood alongside them, pale and silent, eyes glowing faintly in the dark. They woke drenched in sweat, convinced they had touched something more than nightmare. The echoes of the drowned followed them into waking life. Fleets traveling through known wreck sites reported disturbances. Compasses spun, radios cut out, and strange vibrations rippled through the hull. Lookouts claimed to see shadows of ships gliding across the horizon, ghostly silhouettes that vanished when approached. They looked like the outlines of vessels already sunk, trailing smoke and fire that dissolved into mist. The ocean seemed to replay battles long ended, etching their scars into memory. Families of lost sailors sometimes reported hearing knocks at their doors during storms. When opened, no one stood there, but the sound of dripping water lingered on the threshold. Some claimed to hear voices outside, faintly singing songs once sung aboard ships. Though far from the battlefields, these echoes spread ashore as if the drowned carried their stories across the tide, unwilling to vanish completely. One convoy swore they were followed by phantom lights. Small glimmers danced across the waves, resembling lanterns or signal lamps. They blinked in patterns, sometimes matching Morse code. Sailors tried to respond, but their signals were ignored. The lights always kept their distance, drifting alongside through nights of silence. When dawn came, nothing remained but empty water. The lights never brought danger, but they left fear in their wake. Superstitions grew with each encounter. Men began to avoid speaking the names of ships recently sunk, believing to do so invited their echoes. They avoided certain waters at night, claiming the drowned were restless there. Candles were lit in hidden corners of mess halls, not for prayer but for protection. Flames meant to ward away whatever followed. These rituals spread silently, unacknowledged yet universally obeyed. Submarine crews told darker stories. They described hearing pounding along the hull, louder than the knocks sailors reported. The sound grew rhythmic, like hammers striking in unison. Some swore they saw handprints pressed into condensation inside the vessel, as though from those outside trying to force their way in. Engineers scrubbed the marks away, but they always returned. To the men inside, the drowned fleet was not content to rest. One night, a destroyer drifting near a wreck field reported hearing music. A faint harmonica tune floated across the water, rising and falling as if carried on the wind. Sailors crowded the deck, listening in disbelief. The melody was familiar, a song once played by a comrade who had perished weeks earlier. The sound lasted for minutes before fading into silence. No one spoke afterward, their silence heavier than grief. Divers sent to explore wrecks reported strange phenomena. Their instruments malfunctioned, compasses spun, and lights flickered at random. Some claimed to see shadows moving along corridors of sunken ships, shapes in uniform walking as though patrols continued in death. They refused to return, their reports buried in classified files. To those who read the logs, the implication was clear: the drowned did not rest quietly. The ocean floor bore strange scars. Sand shifted in patterns resembling footprints, though no currents could explain them. Wrecks appeared moved slightly from their resting places, tilted at angles inconsistent with sinking alone. Some claimed to hear metallic clangs rising through the water, as though repairs were still being attempted far below. The drowned seemed determined to march, even in the crushing dark. Those who believed in legends tied the echoes to the Serpent itself. They argued that the beast did not merely destroy ships, but consumed their spirits, twisting them into lingering shadows. The echoes were its trophies, reminders of power displayed across oceans. Skeptics laughed, but skeptics could not explain why the echoes always followed battles with no survivors. Whether beast or memory, something called from below. Survivors carried the echoes within themselves. They heard phantom footsteps in their quarters, voices calling their names in empty hallways, the groan of straining hulls long after leaving the sea. Some grew reclusive, unable to silence the sounds. Others drank heavily, trying to drown them out. The echoes followed regardless, unrelenting companions that no distance from the battlefield could erase. Historians decades later uncovered fragments of reports suppressed during the war. Logs mentioned phantom signals, unexplained noises, and crews paralyzed by fear of the drowned. Admirals dismissed them as psychological breakdowns, but the consistency was too great. The echoes had been real, though impossible to categorize. The silence of official records only amplified the legends. Some claimed the echoes were warnings, voices of the lost trying to steer survivors away from the Serpent's hunting grounds. They pointed to instances where ships changed course after hearing phantom cries, only to later discover mines or ambushes avoided. Others believed the drowned sought to drag the living with them, jealous of those who had escaped. Both interpretations spread equally, leaving sailors divided between reverence and terror. Fog often carried the worst of the echoes. Thick banks rolled across the sea, muffling every sound except the groans and whispers. Men swore they heard full conversations in languages they recognized, as though their dead comrades stood just beyond sight. Some followed the voices, leaning too far over rails, never to return. The fog lifted with cruel indifference, leaving only empty decks behind. Shipwrecks revisited years later still carried the echoes. Divers heard knocking on bulkheads, voices calling in static when radios were lowered near hulls. They recorded strange sounds, but playback revealed nothing but silence. The phenomenon resisted capture, existing only in the moment, vanishing once observed too closely. The drowned remained possessive of their secrets. Navies grew reluctant to speak of it, fearing panic. Orders circulated forbidding discussion of phantom signals or voices. Punishments were severe for those caught spreading tales. Yet discipline could not silence fear. Whispers moved through fleets faster than orders, ensuring every sailor knew what awaited in wreck fields. The echoes carried on, stronger than censorship. The echoes became part of the war's landscape. An unspoken reality endured but never explained. Men fought battles above the waves while the drowned lingered below, their presence undeniable. Whether born of memory, myth, or the serpent's hunger, the echoes haunted every survivor. They reminded all who listened that the sea never truly gave up what it claimed. The war ended on land with treaties and parades, but at sea, silence remained broken. Those who had heard the echoes knew they had touched something eternal. The drowned fleet never left, their cries still carried by waves, their signals still bouncing through the static. For those who listened too closely, the message was clear: the war had not ended beneath the water. The echoes ensured it never would. The seas carried more than ships and steel, they carried fear. Whenever the Serpent appeared, men were its true target. Survivors swore it didn't simply capsize vessels for destruction's sake. It sought those trapped in the water, dragging them below with a speed no current could explain. Entire crews disappeared before rescue boats could reach them, their screams cut short by a force hidden beneath the waves. Witnesses described the water boiling as if alive, bubbles rising in massive swells before pulling men under. Some fought to the surface, gasping for breath, only to be seized again and dragged deeper into the abyss. Their arms flailed desperately, but their comrades could only watch in horror. The monster's hunger wasn't random. It felt deliberate, a predator choosing prey one by one. Ships that survived attacks often reported missing men, not lost to gunfire or drowning, but snatched without trace. Lifelines thrown into the water came back shredded, as though bitten clean through. Survivors who clung to rafts swore they felt immense pressure beneath, pushing up and rolling the sea, testing the wood before pulling others down. The ocean itself became a weapon, turned against them. Rescuers described scenes of chaos. They would row toward cries for help, only for the water to grow unnaturally still. Then, in the blink of an eye, the voices were gone. No splash, no struggle, just silence, and a ripple moving away into the dark. Some men fainted at the sight, convinced they'd witnessed not death but erasure. The Serpent didn't leave corpses to bury, it left only memory. On nights when fog blanketed the sea, men felt eyes watching from below. They swore they could see faint lights glowing under the water, like lanterns drifting upward. When the lights surfaced, those who gazed too long often vanished within hours. Whether madness drove them to leap or unseen coils dragged them down, no one could say, but the lights were always followed by absence. Tales spread of the Serpent surfacing, not to fight but to observe. Its massive head would rise silently beside ships, scales glistening with seawater, eyes fixed on the trembling men. It would linger, unmoving, as though deciding who to take. Then, as suddenly as it appeared, it would dive, and the screams began almost immediately. To the sailors, its hunger felt like judgment. Some believed the creature sought out fear itself. Men who panicked, thrashing wildly in the water, were the first to vanish. Those who held their breath and stayed still sometimes survived, as if the Serpent overlooked them. It wasn't only bodies it consumed, but terror, feeding on the chaos of men pushed past the edge of sanity. War gave it an endless banquet. Submariners were not spared. Stories emerged of patrols lost without a trace, their last transmissions garbled with screams and the sound of metal groaning under immense pressure. Divers later claimed to hear scratching along wrecks, deep gouges carved into steel hulls as though something massive had dragged its teeth across them. Entire crews became offerings in the dark, sealed in iron coffins. Some survivors described hearing a roar beneath the water before their comrades vanished. It wasn't the roar of a wave or storm, but something guttural echoing like thunder through the ocean itself. The sound rattled teeth and froze limbs, leaving men unable to move. By the time silence returned, their comrades were gone, taken while paralyzed by the very voice of the predator. Lifeboats became no sanctuary. Those who reached them often felt the craft lurch violently, pulled downward by unseen forces. Nails bent, boards snapped, and survivors clutched desperately as the raft tipped. Some were hurled into the water and never returned, dragged below before they could scream. Those who survived described gouges left behind as though claws had raked across the wood. Fishermen who dared sail near battle zones told stories of nets torn apart by something massive below. They hauled in scraps of uniforms, boots, and gear, but never whole bodies. The seas seemed eager to erase the evidence, returning only fragments to remind men what waited beneath. Rumors spread of entire shoals of fish fleeing the Serpent's hunting grounds, leaving empty waters behind. Men began to dread, not the explosion of shells, but the silence afterward. In still waters, when no gunfire or thunderclouds masked the sea, the Serpent fed most. It thrived in the pause between battles, taking stragglers and wounded when they believed the worst was over. In this way, the quiet ocean became more terrifying than the loudest artillery barrage. Prisoners of war transported by sea sometimes vanished without combat. Ships recorded men missing during night watches. Their chains left behind on deck. Guards swore they heard dragging sounds along the hull, followed by sudden splashes. By morning, dozens could be gone, erased with no chance of escape. The Serpent's hunger respected no side. Every man was prey. Those pulled beneath weren't always silent. Survivors sometimes swore they heard muffled cries rising from the deep, as though voices carried on bubbles. The sounds grew faint, stretched by distance, until they vanished completely. Whether hallucination or truth, the effect was the same. Men froze in terror, knowing their comrades still fought for life in a place they could never reach. Some men prayed desperately, hoping faith might shield them. Chaplains aboard ships reported confessions, whispered at all hours, soldiers begging forgiveness before the next watch. The Serpent turned the war into something more than a clash of nations. It became a test of survival against an ancient hunger that no prayer, bullet, or torpedo could satisfy. Bodies that did resurface bore marks too horrific to explain. Skin shredded in long, parallel grooves, bones snapped clean as though crushed by immense pressure. Medical officers wrote them off as injuries from debris, but sailors knew better. They whispered that these were the lucky ones, spat back out by a monster too full to finish its feast. Fear of water itself took root among entire fleets. Some men refused to bathe, avoiding contact with the sea whenever possible. Others begged for reassignment inland, preferring bullets to drowning. Naval command dismissed their fears as weakness, but the whispers spread regardless. The Serpent's appetite was not just for flesh. It devoured courage, one sailor at a time. Commanders quietly rerouted ships away from certain areas, though never officially recorded. Why? Veterans of those waters muttered the truth. Men disappeared more often there, and wrecks carried stranger scars. The Serpent seemed to follow its own hunting patterns, migrating like a beast of flesh and bone. Those unlucky enough to cross its path rarely escaped unscathed. Whirlpools sometimes appeared where no current should exist. Ships listed suddenly, pulled sideways by invisible hands, while sailors clung to rails to keep from falling overboard. Those who slipped were gone instantly, consumed before their comrades could even shout. The sea closed as quickly as it opened, leaving nothing but trembling men staring at calm water. Survivors left journals filled with half-finished sentences, their words breaking into incoherence whenever they described the attacks. Some sketched crude drawings of coils encircling ships, jaws swallowing lifeboats, eyes like burning orbs beneath the waves. These notes were hidden away, dismissed as hysteria, yet they remain some of the few fragments that hint at what the Serpent's hunger truly meant. Wartime doctors noted the survivors carried more than physical wounds. Many suffered nightmares so vivid they refused to sleep, insisting the Serpent waited for them in their dreams. Some stopped eating, convinced their food carried the taste of brine and blood. Others grew violent, lashing out whenever they heard water drip. The hunger below had carved scars in their minds as deep as the sea. As the war dragged on, whispers spread that the Serpent grew bolder. Men claimed it no longer waited for ships to fall. It struck directly, surfacing among active fleets and taking men in broad daylight. Eyewitnesses describe waves splitting around its body, the sea itself bowing in submission as it claimed its prey. The message was clear. Nothing could sate it. Superstition turned to ritual. Crews tossed offerings of meat, bread, even ammunition into the water, hoping to distract the Serpent. Some cut their own palms, letting drops of blood fall into the sea as tribute. Whether madness or survival instinct, they believed sacrifice might buy them another day. Yet the disappearances never ceased, proving the hunger was endless. Even after battles ended, the Serpent's legacy endured. Survivors spoke less of victory and more of what waited beneath the waves. They carried home stories not of enemy soldiers, but of comrades taken by something older and crueler. For them, the war was not fought only on land or sea. It was fought against a hunger too vast to conquer. And so the Serpent's feast became part of the ocean's memory. The waves whispered its legend, and the currents carried its truth. Whether born of myth or awakened by bloodshed, its appetite left scars history refused to write. To those who survived, one lesson remained. War ends when men stop fighting, but the hunger beneath the waves never sleeps. Naval command offices were places of silence as much as strategy. Reports came in thick folders, pages describing impossible events, ships torn in half without torpedoes, crews disappearing without trace, and sonar detecting living shadows. Admirals skimmed the accounts, exchanged grim looks, and stamped them classified. What they couldn't explain, they chose to bury. The official narrative was always clean. Ships lost were written off to storms, submarines, or enemy bombardments. Yet in private meetings, commanders admitted the records made no sense. Patterns of destruction didn't match any known weapon. Survivors' testimonies painted the same image, a monstrous presence beneath the waves, rather than confront it. Leaders chose erasure. Radio logs disappeared first. Operators who reported phantom signals found their accounts stripped from files. Instead, rewritten documents insisted the machines malfunctioned. If any voice lingered, it was attributed to interference. But sailors who remembered knew better. They swore their own words had been stolen and twisted into silence. Doctors who examined survivors wrote of trauma beyond combat fatigue. Men trembled at the sight of still water, shrieked when the floor creaked beneath their bunks, and muttered about scales and eyes. Yet these notes were redacted, stamped with ink so heavy the paper tore. Officially, there was no monster. Only weakness in men. Witnesses who insisted otherwise faced reassignment. Some were shipped to distant outposts, far from their fleets. Others vanished entirely, their names absent from records after certain dates. Rumors spread among crews that speaking too loudly of what they saw invited more than the Serpent's wrath. It invited the Admiralty's hand. Maps were altered subtly. Certain regions of ocean were avoided without explanation, marked as unstable waters or poor for navigation. Orders rerouted convoys wide around them, though no storms appeared on forecasts. Officers whispered that those waters had been feeding grounds, zones where too many ships had vanished. But no logbook carried those words. Shipwreck divers sent after the war found anomalies. Entire sections of hulls were missing, as though bitten away. Yet photographs of these wrecks never saw daylight. Navy archivists seized them quickly, telling researchers their findings threatened morale. The wreckage itself was eventually left alone, deliberately unstudied. The past was safer beneath the sea. Families of lost men asked questions. They wanted closure, reasons, explanations. Admirals wrote letters with vague reassurances. Your son died bravely in service, but no cause of death was ever included. Wives and mothers clutched folded flags, never knowing the truth that their loved ones had been consumed by something beyond war. A handful of chaplains resisted. They recorded confessions of terrified sailors who described the Serpent in detail. But when these records reached command, they vanished. The chaplains themselves were reassigned, their sermons censored. Faith was encouraged when it soothed fear, but forbidden when it testified to horror's command denied. Engineers raised questions of their own. Steel hulls twisted in shapes, No explosion could explain. Marks carved into ships looked deliberate, as though by claws or teeth. These reports were folded into archives labeled anomalous damage. They were filed away where no sailor, no politician, and no historian could ever find them. As the war dragged on, whispers grew in mess halls that command knew far more than they admitted. Orders to sail certain routes in daylight, to avoid lowering lifeboats after nightfall, or to maintain silence at sea seemed too specific. Crews realized these rules weren't about efficiency, they were about survival, but the reasoning was hidden. Some admirals believed ignoring the creature was the only way to win the war. Men fight men, they argued. Monsters belong to myths. To acknowledge it would fracture morale, to write it down would give it permanence. And so silence became the shield they raised, though it left sailors defenseless against something far worse than shells. Whistleblowers tried to speak out. A few officers wrote letters to newspapers, describing impossible encounters at sea. Yet none of these letters ever reached print. Editors received visits, warnings were issued, and the words disappeared. Sailors later joked that the ocean wasn't the only thing swallowing voices. The Admiralty was just as hungry. Naval archives, after the war, were gutted. Scholars found gaps in timelines, missing months of radio traffic, and battle records redacted with entire pages blank. When pressed, archivists shrugged. Files had been lost in the confusion of war. Yet the pattern was too clean. Only the stories of impossible predators had gone missing. Those who dared to press the issue faced ridicule. Historians dismissed the stories as hallucinations of exhausted men. Skeptics pointed to myths, claiming sailors always imagined monsters. Admirals encouraged this interpretation. Preferring ridicule over revelation, it was easier for the world to laugh than to believe. Some commanders even encouraged myths as camouflage. They allowed rumors of ghosts and demons to circulate. Confident skeptics would dismiss them. Better for the Serpent to be mistaken as superstition than admitted as fact. In this way, truth was hidden in plain sight, dismissed because it wore the mask of folklore. Years later, secret memos surfaced in fragments. They spoke of unidentified aquatic threats and incidents inconsistent with known technology, but each memo stopped short of naming what survivors already knew. The language was cold, clinical, drained of the horror that defined the encounters. Bureaucracy replaced screams with sterile phrases. Men who lived long enough to retire carried bitterness. They had been silenced, dismissed, erased. Their grandchildren heard fragments in whispers of shadows in the sea, of something command refused to name. For those who served, the betrayal wasn't only the Serpent's hunger. It was leadership's choice to let it feed unchecked. A few researchers in later decades connected the dots. They found references in ship logs, faint scribbles in margins, diaries hidden by families. Pieced together, they painted a story far darker than official history. Yet even then, pushback came swiftly. Funding vanished, access was denied, and careers ended. The silence remained. Conspiracy theories bloomed in the absence of truth. Some claimed admirals had tried to weaponize the Serpent, luring it toward enemy fleets. Others believed secret experiments had awakened it, and cover-ups were meant to hide guilt. None could be proven, but in the void left by official lies, speculation thrived. What mattered most to survivors was not whether the Serpent was explained, it was that it was never acknowledged. They had lost comrades to something no bullet could stop, and command had told them to forget. That betrayal burned deeper than fear, leaving scars that time could not erase. The archives still hum with silence. Documents remain missing, testimonies remain hidden, and the official story of the war is clean, polished, sanitized. Yet the ocean keeps its own record. Shipwrecks scarred with teeth, sonar pings of impossible size, and whispered testimonies passed down through families remain no matter how many files are destroyed. Silence served two masters. It shielded nations from panic, but it also fed the Serpent's legend. By refusing to admit the truth, admirals ensured it would grow in shadows, whispered across generations. The beast survived not only in the water, but in the lies inked across official history. The sailors who endured knew the truth could not be erased. They saw comrades vanish, ships crushed, and seas torn apart by something vast and alive. The admirals buried the records, but memory remained alive in the men themselves. And though their voices faded with time, their warnings lingered in every ripple of the sea. And so the cover-up stands as its own monument, not carved in stone, not etched in bronze, but hidden in silence. Admirals chose secrecy over truth, and in doing so, they bound history to myth. Yet the ocean does not forget. Its depths still echo with screams. Its wrecks still tell the story that men above tried to erase. The war's end brought parades, flags, and speeches, but the ocean carried no celebration beneath the surface. Wrecks remained scattered like bones across the seabed. Survivors tried to believe the horrors would sink with the ships, yet the sea kept shifting as though something still stirred. Quiet nights at harbor brought uneasy glances toward the horizon. Fishermen who returned to old waters reported nets shredded, not by rocks or reefs, but by something sharp and deliberate. Their catches came up thin, as if entire schools of fish avoided those depths. The sea was restless, and though no warships patrolled anymore, sailors swore it felt just as hostile. The enemy had never left. Storms gathered with strange timing. Clouds rose suddenly over calm waters, winds roaring as though summoned. Lightning struck in eerie patterns, illuminating shadows across the waves. The men who watched claimed to see shapes too vast for whales, ridges slicing the surface before vanishing again. Even nature seemed to bend around something unseen. The silence was its most chilling gift. On moonless nights, sailors found the ocean too quiet, without gulls, without waves. The stillness pressed on them like weight, and they whispered that the sea was holding its breath. What lay below was not asleep, they said, but waiting. The hush carried a threat more piercing than thunder. Wreck divers decades later returned with stories just as unsettling. They described hulls freshly scarred despite lying dormant for years, new gouges cut into steel. Some heard groaning through the water, a low vibration that shook their bones. They surfaced shaking, eyes wide, claiming the wrecks themselves were not abandoned but watched over by something alive. The Serpent's legend grew as veterans aged. In smoky bars, men who had sworn to silence spoke in half-whispers. They described seas that churned when no storms blew, the feeling of being hunted even while anchored in safe harbors. Younger listeners dismissed them, but the fear in their eyes told another story. Local fishermen carried the tales forward. They claimed certain bays held voices that echoed against the cliffs, deep moans rolling like the sound of giant lungs. Those who lingered too long heard their names whispered in the surf. Villages nearby abandoned these shores, calling them cursed. The land remembered what the sea refused to bury. Ships that crossed those waters in later decades often reported malfunctions. Compasses spun, radios cut out, and sonar lit up with readings the size of islands moving beneath. Crews tried to dismiss them as glitches, but the reports mirrored each other too closely. Something massive still prowled the depths. Strange currents plagued submariners. Entire patrols described being dragged sideways by invisible forces. Their vessels groaned as if caught in coils, hulls straining under pressure before being released without warning. These encounters left sailors pale and shaken, swearing they had been squeezed by an unseen hand. Some encounters grew more violent. Cargo ships reported sudden waves rising without storm, smashing decks and sweeping men overboard. Survivors described seeing ridges slicing through the water just before the swell struck. These weren't natural tsunamis. They were movements, deliberate and immense, reminders that the sea itself could rise at will. Legends spread that the creature never needed to feed constantly. It waited years, even decades, before rising again. But when it did, it reminded men that the ocean was never truly theirs. The survivors called these periods of quiet, false peace. The silence was not safety, it was patience. In isolated harbors, locals spoke of nights when the water glowed faintly red. Lanterns cast no reflections, as though the surface refused to mirror light. Those brave enough to approach swore the glow came from beneath, pulsing in rhythm like a colossal heartbeat. They left quickly, certain they had stared too close into the body of something alive. Explorers with advanced sonar in later years revealed outlines too large to catalog. Their machines traced curves that wrapped around entire basins, shadows coiled like chains across the seafloor. When they returned to analyze the data, the recordings were corrupted, scrambled into static. Technology seemed to falter under the weight of the truth. Mariners began leaving offerings. Bottles of liquor, coins, even drops of blood were cast into the water before voyages. These gestures were whispered superstitions, but they spread across fleets. Sailors did not fear storms or pirates as much as they feared what no eye could see. Respect was their only weapon. The ocean floor carried reminders of its appetite. Wrecks shifted positions, moved against the current. Some rose slightly before collapsing again, as though something beneath had lifted them. Divers swore they saw hulls sway like carcasses dragged by unseen ropes. The deep had its own tides, pulled not by the moon, but by hunger. Villagers along coastlines heard strange vibrations late at night. Windows rattled, dishes shook, and dogs barked at empty horizons. They described it as the earth itself humming. Scientists offered explanations of distant earthquakes, yet the tremors came without fault lines, only near certain waters marked long ago by veterans. Whale carcasses washed ashore in grotesque condition. Entire sections of flesh were missing, peeled clean as though bitten. Bones cracked with unnatural precision. Skulls split neatly down the center. Marine biologists studied them in vain, unable to explain the symmetrical violence. To the locals, it was simple. Something still fed below. Fishermen avoided deep waters during full moons. They claimed the tides moved wrong, currents reversing without reason. Boats left adrift often drifted back damaged, their hulls scarred and nets torn. Some returned empty-handed. Others didn't return at all. The deep didn't care for schedules. It chose its moments. As technology advanced, sonar captured more anomalies. Entire fleets recorded identical readings, vast shapes moving slowly, then vanishing. Reports were quietly filed away, just as they had been in wartime. Officials labeled them anomalies, malfunctions, anything but what sailors already knew. The deep silence continued to win against truth. Stories of survivors never lost their edge. Men old and frail still woke from nightmares, gasping as though dragged under once again. They spoke of water pressing on their lungs, of eyes glimmering in endless black. Age didn't dull the memory, it only sharpened the sense that the ocean was unfinished business. In time, the Serpent's presence blended into myth. Some called it the Midgard Serpent. Others named it simply the shadow below. Yet regardless of the name, sailors treated the sea with reverence edged in fear. Myths exist because something planted them, and in this case the seed still stirred beneath the waves. The greatest horror lay in its patience. Men had learned that monsters above the waves could be defeated with bullets and bombs, but monsters below, they needed only time. The ocean was eternal, and patience was its weapon. The Serpent didn't need constant attack. It needed only to wait for another generation to forget. Even the air above those waters carried weight. Birds flew wide arcs to avoid certain patches, their flocks breaking as though guided by instinct. Clouds seemed to stall over those regions, shadows lingering long after the sun moved on. Nature itself recoiled from the same unseen presence that men denied. Legends whispered that the Serpent wasn't a single creature at all, but something endless, its coils circling the world. Ships glimpsed only fragments, like men touching part of a mountain beneath the sea. If true, no weapon could ever slay it. The ocean wasn't its home, it was its body. What remains certain is this: the deep has never stopped stirring, whether in shattered sonar echoes, in whale carcasses split unnaturally, or in sailors' dreams that claw them awake. The reminder is clear. The war may have ended, but the sea never rests. Its hunger outlives history. Its silence is not peace, and in that silence lies a warning. What waits below does not sleep, it does not age, and it does not forgive. The deep remains, watching, hungering, waiting for men to once again forget the lessons written in blood across its waves. When they return in arrogance, it will rise. The records of war will always speak of tanks, bombers, and the clash of nations. Yet in the darkest corners of history, there are scars the official reports refuse to name. The sailors who swore of a serpent beneath the waves were silenced, their testimonies buried under ink and secrecy, but oceans are patient and legends never truly die. Perhaps Jörmungandr returned to its depths, satisfied with the blood it tasted during humanity's greatest war, or perhaps it waits still, coiled in the black silence, ready for the day men once again wage battles across the seas. What is certain is this: not every horror of World War II carried a flag. Some rose from the deep, and some may rise again.